take a look. The cases are back together. We did some work to the cylinder. So we're cracking our intake at 80 exactly, which is pretty good. Didn't want to go over 80. We're cracking our exhaust at 100. That's exactly where we wanted it to be. Now, the transfers, let's talk about the transfers because we did some work to the lower transfers. We opened those up a little bit, lowered them down. However, the upper transfers, we had to do some decision making. Check, 1, 2, okay. So our 066 red light worksheet. We're taking the scored stock piston out. We're putting in a highway pop-up, a little crown work. We're going to run 2 rings on this saw. Base and band cut on the cylinder. 4 degrees off. Muffler mod, we had to modify the baffle. We had to remove the old crusty, rusty spark arresters. Exhaust port widened about 2 millimeters for about 5% more width. Intake port was left stock. It was cleaned up and roughed up. Upper and lower transfer work was done. SKF C&U bearings on the crank. New seals, AVs, lines, carb boot, everything rubber is getting replaced. New oil pump and worm gear because the clutch side bearing took those out because of excessive play. And then new ignition coil because the ignition coil was rubbing on the flywheel. Hopefully our flywheel is still good. The saw ran, so hopefully our flywheel is still good, but I'm probably going to pull a coil off of another part saw and throw on there. Intake port, so that went from 76 to 80. Exhaust port, after our piston and cylinder work, went from 97 to 100. Transfers started out, I think they were at 121 if I remember. So then after we ground, we ended up at 125, and then after I did the transfer work, we ended up at 20, giving us a 20-degree blowdown. Case compression, then I believe should have started out at 45 and went to 40. But with that diagonal upper transfer port, we should still be progressively bleeding off. So I think 40 is going to be a sufficient number for that. And then squish is set at 24 thou. So that's our worksheet. Now, on this upper transfer port, I had to make a decision. I had to make a judgment call here because when we cut 4 degrees off the base, I ended up covering up an additional 4 degrees at the bottom of the transfer. And we're adding 8 degrees of additional duration on our intake, and we're adding quite a bit of volume to the bottom of this transfer. So I got to get it all up. If I don't get it all up, we're in trouble. So I feel like I got to get this upper transfer port to dump all of that charge in the amount of time that we're going to give it. So after we cut, because the shape is angled up towards the intake, it's a diagonal port. So after we cut 4 degrees off, whereabouts, our upper transfer is now cracking at 125, and then this side is probably opening somewhere around 130, and we're covering up the bottom our piston looks like this. We're covering up the bottom 4 degrees of that transfer. So how do I compensate for that? So I would have loved to have left 25 degrees of blowdown. And if we had it, if I had it and liked it, I would have just left it. But I feel like I need to add and compensate for this, the bottom of this transfer coverage. So what I'm going to do, or what I did, was I widened it. I took a measurement to see how wide we could go before we get to the ring end. The guide pin on the piston is almost 1/4 of an inch from here. So we have a little bit of room to play with before we get to what we would consider our ring end over here, or a danger zone. So I widened this port 2 millimeters and then raised it up over here about 5 degrees. And then we're transitioning back down into the same curve on the backside. So now up here, I'm cracking that upper transfer at 120. My exhaust is at 100, and I'm cracking my transfer at 120. I guess you could say I have 20 degrees of blowdown, right? But that doesn't really tell the whole story. Because if I would have ground, I feel like if I would have ground this port flat across the top, you could say, yeah, you've just got 20 degrees of blowdown. But because we're transitioning back down and leaving that stock shape, it's really not a true, in my opinion, 20 degrees. It might act more like it has a 22 or 23 degree blowdown, in my opinion. And this is trial and error. We don't know anything for sure. And this side would probably be opening at 125 now. So this was just an effort to try to compensate for this coverage and get all of this charge up and in to the combustion chamber, so we don't over intake our saw and start shooting mixture back out the intake. The exhaust port, smooth finish, and you can see it was given a little width here. And if we look at it from inside here, we still need to do some cleanup work. There's some little bit of transfer on the cylinder, but we'll get that cleaned up. So if we look at the exhaust port on the inside, we can see that it was widened on the sides and then transitioned back to the factory chamfer. I didn't touch anything on the top of that exhaust port. The intake port was left stock. I just cleaned it up and scored it up with rough sandpaper, but you can see the inside is all factory shape. There's a little bit of transfer and some lines that we'll clean this the cylinder up at the very end here and clean and shine that all up. The transfers got pretty standard work. A slight widening on the sides, and then we lowered the lower transfer and a smooth transition from the bottom. And you can see here where I didn't grind at the choke point, where we build our velocity, there's some carbon buildup on that. So this saw was running with some exhaust gas reverting back down and contaminating the charge on the transfers. So that we can probably attribute to air leak. I would assume with that much play in that PTO side bearing that there was no way that seal was holding. And I would assume that we weren't boosting our charge up with nearly any pressure because of that. So that's why we were pushing exhaust gas back down. Okay, we got our piston and cylinder work done. Cleaned up the casting marks on the piston windows and bottom edge. Nothing extreme done to the piston because we want this to be a good, reliable work saw. It's going to have a lot of torque. It's got to be strong. We got our parts washed up. Let's throw this thing together and fire it up.